Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. Today's video is regarding China, Islam, and the West. And I'm going to make it a dead brief one because my wife will be going home any moment. Extra brownie points to anybody who knows what football top I am wearing. Comment it down below in the comment section. Blue and yellow, sponsored by Pepsi. It's not a brand new top. We are rewinding several years, over a decade, but I always like the blue and yellow, same colors as my school. Into it we jump. Apologies for the digression. So, China, Islam and the West. This is in response to a amazing podcast short interview that I listened to recently. Mehdi Hassan and Victor Gao, who is a staunch advocate of the Chinese Communist Party. I have a special interest in China and kind of Eastern culture, having studied Mandarin Chinese for a handful of years, attaining my HSK 1 language qualification, which is basically the equivalent to A1, kind of the first step of language competence in any language. HSK standing for Hanyue HS Shui Ping Kaishe. Hanyue Shui Ping Kaishe, which is basically something along the lines of language proficiency test. And, I was looking into teaching English in China, as many young university students do in Britain, America, Canada, Australia, Ireland, South Africa, etc. And one day, by the grace of God, I will go to China. But China has a very fascinating history in relation to Islam. You have a population almost 10 times, approximately 10 times larger in China than the UK Muslim population. So this interview, I certainly recommend people go and watch it. Mehdi Hassan and Victor Gao talk about the Chinese Communist Party. And I thought that I would at least mention a few things that came to mind. So, of course, when we talk of China, we have three territories of not significance, but of controversy and of the utmost importance. First of all, you have the special administrative region of Hong Kong, which in 1997, the year in between my birth and my younger brother's birth, was handed over from the British. It was known effectively as the death of the empire. The now King Charles III was present, handing back the territory, the overseas territory of Hong Kong, the British, formerly British territory, back to the Chinese Communist Party, but under a special two systems, one nation, that's not the right term, two systems, one party approach, which gave the Hong Kong, the Cantonese people, a special status, allowing them to have autonomy over the region for a 100-year period, obviously culminating in 2097, at which point I believe it will be handed over to the Chinese Communist Party. And that's the first point to make, is you have the disputed territory of Hong Kong. You also have Taiwan, which is this is really a continuation, as Victor Gao says, of the civil war in which the then government fled to the island off the, I believe it's East China Sea. Those two, there's tension there. You have kind of a squashing of autonomy, a controlling of the democracy by the CCP. And also in Taiwan, it almost seems like it's imminent conflict, because the majority of Taiwanese people see themselves as distinctly Taiwanese and not part of the mainland, but the mainland claimed Taiwan as part of the one China policy. But what's more relevant to a discussion in relation to Islam would be the what is claimed by some against the One China policy to be the East Turkmenistan region. I believe it's, forgive me if my pronunciation or even just the straight words is wrong, but the province of Xinjiang. I believe it's the province of Xinjiang. I believe it's the largest province. It's the most western province, and it has potentially the highest proportion of Muslims, the Uyghurs, who are notoriously by many international human rights organizations being held against their will in concentration camps. Many have called it a genocide. What Victor Gao says that I found was interesting is that it's not so much an issue of religion, rather separatism and independence, because you do have a large Chinese ethnic group in China, of course. I'm just getting a message from my wife, hence my distraction. I have to make sure that she and my sister-in-law are okay. But back to the video. I believe it's the Hui ethnic group who, I mean, you have a rich Islamic history in, for example, the former capital city where the terracotta warriors reside. I believe it's Xi'an. And Xi'an translates to Western peace, peace in the West, I believe, if my Chinese has any validity. And you have, for example, there in the city, a Muslim quarter, halal food, people living an Islamic lifestyle, but they also have appropriately assimilated to some degree into Chinese culture. That does not mean that they have to eat pork and, follow fully the Chinese festive calendar. No, they can live their lives as Muslims, although they see themselves as Chinese and part of the One China policy. So that's what Victor Gao said. He says, in China, it is not appropriate to, what's the word I'm looking for? To basically oppose the One China policy, to dissent, to show your dissent. And this brings me to the point at hand, which is really talking about what one is allowed to say in China or in England. And a point I found fascinating from Victor Gao. Now, of course, deflection does not legitimately answer questions of potential human rights atrocities, not at all. But when asked about potential atrocities happening in China, what about the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang province? He responded, well, what about the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay? Now, obviously, he's not addressed the question at hand directly, but I thought that it raised a good point. Almost, Victor Gao is suggesting, who are you on your Western, quote-unquote, democratic high horse to tell us about human rights atrocities? What about Iraq and Afghanistan? What about the war against terror? What about lying about weapons of mass destruction? What about going into endless conflict all over the world for your own personal economic gain? The creation of hegemony, I believe that's the correct term. So I found this very interesting because China has not been at war in over, in my lifetime, as far as I'm aware. Over the last 30 years, China has not been at war, but in fact, the US and the UK have. And so it's a really interesting thing, the old pointing of the finger, and you've got three pointing back at yourself. Yes, although he would not accept the authoritarian rule of President Xi, he would not accept the terminology of dictator, but he did push back and say, well, we have voting system too. Now on that voting ballot, you have one name, that's President Xi. On our voting ballot, okay, we might have 5 or 6 or 7 names, but it's again similar to the US system, the first past the post, where it's basically a 2-horse race. You have the Republicans and the Democrats, you have the Conservatives and the Labour Party. And that may be overcome by, God knows where Reform UK will be. The Liberal Democrats formed the coalition government in 2010, I believe. So minor things can change, but the question at hand is that whether it's Republican or Democrat, whether it's Labour or Tory, are these two sides of what I'm suggesting is the same coin funded by the same economic elites, by the same corporations? Are their ends not incredibly similar, although guised in the West as genuine freedom and genuine choice? Oh, to go to the ballot and cross your decision, although many of the decisions are already made. And this now needs to be spoken about in more depth, that this is not conspiratorial. This is straight economic sabotage. This is straight disparity of wealth increasing at a rate that we have never seen. And it's being done under the guise of freedom and democracy. And you as an individual, you are free because you can hold a placard, you can hold a sign and say, down with a monarchy, death to King Charles. But as Victor Gao said, what freedom really is that? The freedom of a cathartic release. That is to say, you feel better because you've shouted in the street and you have held a poster outside the gates of Buckingham Palace. But you have no genuine ability or freedom, zero capability to actually tear down the monarchy. It would be impossible. It would be treason. It would not be accepted. It would be an act of war, and you would be dealt with appropriately. And if you had any genuine plans to do so, you would be taken down. There's just no doubt about that. The monarchy in the United Kingdom is entrenched to a degree. It's like the Matrix. You cannot, maybe 100 years ago, maybe 200 years ago, you had the French, you had the Americans, they broke away. That was one of the last chances. And do I think the American and French system is any better off anyway? Not particularly. So I think that there's an illusion, whether it's a republic, whether it's a monarchy, albeit constitutional, or even if it is a complete autocratic, a complete authoritarian monarchy, or whether it's the Communist Party with a dose of democracy, but in reality akin to a dictatorship. Are these all just different paths that really, I don't know how to describe it exactly, forgive me. What is the difference really if one is more truthful, you know where you stand, albeit there will be propaganda, indoctrination campaigns in China, I'm sure. But that to some degree happens, I think, in England as well, because there's this, I don't know how to describe it. You have a connection. If you don't reject, for example, the monarchy, if you accept their existence and you accept that they're entrenched into not only, of course, history, but the future as well, you have a kind of connection to it. They're on the money, they're on the stamps, that, the post boxes and so many things. HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, that's where you pay your tax to. It's inextricably linked to the government itself. Even when it's the King's Speech and when the politicians in the House of Commons and such come in, they swear allegiance to the King. It's part of the whole system. So how dissimilar, or, maybe it's more prominent that, you have primary school children, they're being taught about President Xi and to love Xi and such. But I guess my point is with this, what I wanted to say, and when I really looked at it, I started to question how different are these two systems. One gives what I would argue is a guise of democracy, a guise of freedom. You can, shout in the streets and say down with the monarchy, but it doesn't really do anything. And so, like say, beyond, an illusion of freedom, I can do this, but you can't actually change anything. And just having the more kind of orderly, which as far as I'm aware is a more kind of the Chinese people, they have a sense of, that even their family hierarchy, they have a meekness, they have a reservedness, they have a more subservient and acquiescent culture traditionally, a more structured culture. Perhaps us Brits us Europeans have a more tumultuous and rebellious nature. By definition, the overthrowing of, I mean, I'm sure there's, I don't know, monastic would be monastery, the monarchical history of China too deeply, but I'm sure there was plots to overthrow and such. But my point being that when I talk about China, Islam, and the West, I don't think, as far as I'm aware, and this is not to justify or lighten, like say human rights atrocities across the world, and these are, my point is, these are present across the world. These are not unique to China. And let's not pretend for one moment that we can point a finger at China when we have our own issues currently and in the past. And China would just be thinking, like, who are you guys to be telling us about anything? This is almost ridiculous. There's this kind of Western supremacy vibe of like telling China off because it's a bad child. When you came to our lands, the opium wars were disgusting. You took our lands. We basically, it comes back to bite you. You know, we should have never, and I say we, I'm talking historically here, that it seems like a bit of a mistake when the British Empire, Pax Britannica, was at its height, and we kind of had dominance over the Chinese region. As that Pax Britannica evolved into Pax Americana, and as we came into the current day, you know, the 20th century, and moving as we are now into the 21st century, and China in the recent decades, in my lifetime, the last 30 years, has reestablished itself as a major world power, the second military spending only behind the United States, and a huge landmass and a huge number of people and a huge influence, and a very, as Victor Gao says in the interview between him and Mehdi Hassan, it's incredibly efficient. Skyscrapers, production, building, of course, that comes with a lot of maybe dissatisfaction amongst the people and pollution, and as Victor Gao speaks about, an increasingly growing elderly population, you know, the encouragement as we have across the entire world, lack of fertility. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a lot of problems at hand and I didn't like the sentiment of basically shouting down China, because I think it's more nuanced than that. It's more not refined, but like I say, nuance would be a perfectly legitimate word to use. And when it comes to Islam in China, of course, the party line will always have to be towed, which really means that China will not fully allow any religion to have a full say, which means that religious freedoms likely are limited. It's not a Muslim country at the end of the day. It is a irreligious country that has had a religious revival in the 20th century. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to all nations, people, groups that have done things that are, you know, that don't hit the mark, that don't hit the target, that are not really most becoming, I always attempt to have some sympathy and understand the position they are coming from. And I just wanted to kind of get the conversation going. If you've watched the video this far, then please do subscribe, like the video. Always remember, big up your good selves. I've just touched on just a mere few points here, but I am going to have to call my wife because I'm getting some messages come through. The main thing, Victor Gao, Mehdi, I believe it's Mehdi Hassan, interview is about 1 hour long. It talks about the Chinese Communist Party. It talks about atrocities happening in the world. It's a conversation about freedom. It's a conversation about rights. I've thrown in religion there because they talk about the Uyghur community in the western part of China. And really what I was going to say is that I don't think it's an issue of religion. It is more an issue of separatism and independence, which China will not accept, and that seems very clear, not just based on what Victor Gao said, but also on what I've read about China in the past. So, 谢谢 for watching, thank you, And until next time, 再见.